another session with After His Heart Ministries. I'm Rabbi Q. This is Zohara, and we are going to be doing the Midrash Rabba 2.0, basically the Midrash of the Sages 2.0. And today we are going to talk about the concept of what it means to draw near and to a king versus approach a king, and what it means to live in Goshen. All that today in the 3 installments of Vayigash, and he approached. Okay, so jumping right in, basically the first thing that we do in Midrash Rabbah is Zohara will read the questions on, we have a Slack network that basically is where the core ministry of brothers and sisters meets online, because our constituency is actually more online than it is local. And we are actually going to we're going to read questions that have been posted in the Midrash channel, and we'll work through those and kind of identify. And we're going to do about 30 minutes per one. We'll take a few breaks. We'll have some larger breaks for lunch and a larger break for a rest, and then we'll finish out the day with the Rabbi's Nugget.
So question number 1. What does it mean that evil shall overtake Jacob?
Okay, so when Judah, so just to put things in perspective really quick, I'll remind you that basically what has happened is the brothers were sent back to their father with their food, and what they found is that each man had his money in his sack, but also there was somebody who had Joseph's cup in one of the sacks, and Benjamin was the one found with it. And the guard, Joseph's guard, had gone and arrested them and brought them back to Joseph. Joseph has basically said, now you're all my slaves. And Judah steps up to the plate and says, I need to intervene here. And what Judah does is he basically asserts that if he doesn't bring Benjamin back, that something is going to happen to Jacob. And that's actually what I want to talk about today. So let's go ahead. We'll go ahead and I will share the verse, and we can chat about what we've got going on here. So let me go ahead and we'll do that real quick. Okay, here we go. Okay, so in chapter 44, and going down to verse 34, it says, "For how shall I go up to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear that I may see the evil that would overtake my father." So a couple things. First of all, is this word find, I think, is important. But also, I want to remind you all a little bit about the word evil. So to really be constructive on how I address this, what we need to do is basically just kind of look from the perspective of the word evil here. Okay. So here is the Hebrew word evil, which is ra. Now, before, let me do something real quick here, just to take care of a quick little housekeeping thing, so to speak. Languages have some originality to them this far back in history. Okay. So, what I mean by that is the word raw today, which would be like raw meat or a rawness or a organic feel to something, an uncut footage, etc., where we use the word raw, has no relation to the Egyptian god Ra, and we don't have that issue. Okay. But as soon as a Christian hears that the Hebrew word for evil is Ra, they make a connection to the god Ra of Egypt. Not so, not the case. Okay. The reason I want to bring this up and make it clear is because languages at that time did not have that close of a relation to each other as people may think. In fact, at the Tower of Babel, there were 70 nations. Those 70 nations then became 70 different languages, no connection between them. The only reason I bring this up is because I do not want you to immediately attach a false god to the word Ra and then have us be distracted by the depth of the power of this word evil, translated back to the Hebrew, the word Ra. The reason for this has two elements to it. The first one, and this is imperative, is that this same Hebrew letter set, and I will remind you that in the Hebrew scroll, there was no vowel points. In fact, if there are vowel points in a scroll today, it most likely is not an original kosher scroll. There are some exceptions, and I'm not going to get into those. So I don't want somebody getting on here and saying, oh, well, you know what? There are kosher scrolls that have vowel points. I will fix this whole entire problem. In the time of the writing of Torah, there were pictures, not vowel points. Okay. The consonants in the Hebrew language were pictures, and there are glottal stops, and there are some soundings that kind of make things into vowels, like the vav and the yod. But truth be told, is beyond that, it is just a consonant language. Now, the reason why this is important is because the picture itself is a letter pair, a pair of two drawings, not characters, not ideographic letters, but instead pictographic letters. In other words, Torah was somewhat written in hieroglyphs. Now, where this becomes important is in the fact that when you have a Hebrew word that doesn't have any vowel points, we would look at this same letter pair set, and I will show you this in this way. Now, for those of you who have been in the congregation for a while, you know that you already know a little bit of this, but I'm just going to rehash through it real quick. So first of all, you see the Resh Ayin. Okay, Resh Ayin. If you were to go, here, let me show you this real quick. If you were to go to Psalm 119, now I haven't showed people this for a long, long time, and you were to go to, say, King James Version, maybe not King James Version. Let's try, maybe it's let's try NLT. No, I don't know that any of these are going to actually have. There we go. Okay. So you can see in Psalm 119, every 8 verses is broken up into a letter set. Now, in the Hebrew, this is important. And I'm not going to get too much into this, but let me just show you this in the Hebrew. So I'm going to use the Westminster Leningrad Codex. In the Hebrew, every single verse starts with an aleph until you get to verse 8. And then every single verse starts with a beit until you get to verse 16. And then every verse starts with a gimel. So Psalm 119 is a good way to know what the Hebrew alphabet is in terms of its order, and also what each letter is. Okay. And it looks like if you're using the Blue Letter Bible, the Holman Christian Standard Bible is probably a good one. But what I want to do is I want to scroll down here to this letter. It appears after the it appears after the Samek in the letter set. Ayin. Okay. Now this word ayin actually means eye, as in what we see with in Hebrew. Okay. However, this particular drawing isn't like the ancient pictograph. So let me show you a quick evolution that we need to kind of jump through here. Okay. And what we'll do is we'll go to the history of the ayin, which is at the end of this section about the letters. And the reason I'm switching through these like this is in case you want to pause and look at the letters. There we go. There's the ayin. Okay. And very specifically, we want to look at this particular thing here. So first of all, 2,000 years. Okay. So basically 2000 BC, it was the picture of an eye. And you could see how it kind of looks like an eye, like what we see in art. In the 1500s, it began, and then this is BC, in the 1500s, it began to take upon itself more of a circular shape with a dot in the middle. Then in the 1000s, it lost the dot. Okay. Now, what you'll notice here is that there's no more Canaanite history after 1000 BC. We start to get into the actual Hebrew letters, okay, and also the Phoenician and the Aramaic, also the early Greek and the Punic are the only ones that seem to survive after 1000. So in the 500s, that's what we have. But then in the 100s, the ayin begins to take a very different course. And you can see it turned into kind of a triangle shape for the Hebrew. It turns into this kind of this twisted looking thing in the Aramaic, and also in the Arabic in the 100s. Okay, so this is about 100 years before Yeshua was on the scene. Okay, now what I want to show you is the evolution through the languages. So what I want you to see is that our modern day Hebrew lettering system is actually Aramaic and not Hebrew. It was a circle in Hebrew in the 100s, right before Yeshua. But the Aramaic is what survived. The reason for that is because of the influence of the Babylonian peoples and their lettering system upon the Hebrews, okay, in the late to early 100s, okay, or I'm sorry, early to late 100s. But what I want you to notice is that there is a development here of this letter becoming a certain letter sound, as it were. And you notice it's the Greek omicron or ah sound. It's the Latin ah or o. It's the Aramaic ayin, the Arabic ayin. It's the Samaritan ayin and the Hebrew ayin, which of today we would say that the Hebrew circle like that is actually a Semitic. Okay, so the reason I wanted to show you this is because when we are working in the Hebrew with this word, we have to be very cautious. To really understand the level of these ramifications, what I want to do is go ahead and type in to the text, and actually I can't do it. I can't type in Hebrew on this particular tablet. So then what we need to do then is just actually go get the Strong's Concordance number. So the reason I bring this up is what I want to show you. Let's just look at this. Everybody, every Christian knows Psalm 23, not Psalm 18, Psalm 23. Everybody knows Psalm 23, right? Now, in Psalm 23, we see the Lord is my shepherd. Let's go ahead and set this. The Lord is my shepherd, and it pulls up the word in the Hebrew, ra'ah. Now, if we go back to this point here, should be pretty quick, we'll get back to our word evil. Do you guys see that? Do you see that this, if there was no vowel points, we have the concept here of evil becoming pastor, friend, female companion, and specifically friend or shepherd. Okay. And when we look in Psalm 23, if I go and I click here in Psalm 23, you can, and look in the reverse inline, you can see that, I'm sorry, forward inline. You could see that this word shepherd is actually rooted in that word pastor, okay? But very specifically is coming from the concept of friend. So let me explain. The reason I bring this up is because on the one side, we have the Resh Ayin, which I've showed you now through that system. And this is a time when I really wish I still had my my whiteboard. But the thing is what I want you to see is that there is kind of a twisted looking letter in the Aramaic. And it evolves from that for a reason. Let me show you this one more time, just to really kind of nail this home, okay? In such a way that it would make sense. Going back into this history set, what I want you to see is how out of the middle of nowhere in the Aramaic, it starts looking like this twisted thing. Versus and also in the Arabic, it's that way. But all the rest of the lettering systems, including Samaritan, Latin, and Greek, and Hebrew, all have the circle as if it's still an eyeball. But the Aramaic takes a turn. And the Arabic takes a turn. It's very different from the rest. And there's no true evolution. We could try and say, well, this particular set here in the Phoenician in 500 breaks with the circle and eventually becomes this thing with a tail on the end of it. But I have a better explanation. I have a better proposal for those who care to take the time to understand it. There is a missing Hebrew letter from the letter set. If you read through Psalm 119, there are 22 sections. However, before Torah was written, during the time of Job, there was a 23rd letter. Now, there's a couple things that are interesting about this. The first one, and this is important, is the Hebrew language goes from 23 letters, which is a prime, to 22 letters, which is not a prime. Now, I'm not going to get too much into this, except to say that the number 23 has a lot of implications and when it comes to gematria. But what's significant about the number 22 versus the number 23 is that once it goes from being a prime to not being a prime, then we can do some other tricks with the number 22. For example, it's actually 11 doubled. And 11 is the struggle from human government to theocratic government. 11 is the transition. But every time that you see 11 in the whole of the 66 book compendium of the Protestant canon, or what we would call the Bible, there is a constant of 11 being important. There's a significance in how many brothers were left over from Jacob's 12, right? There's a significance in how many disciples were left over after Judas is removed. There's a transition from 10 to 11 to 12. And when it's in 12, it's theocratic. When it's in 10, it is basically not necessarily man ran, because that would almost indicate ego ran, but instead a transition from King Saul to King David, from man after the people's own heart to a man after God's own heart, right? And that's that transition. So 11 is significant. There's a number of other things we can do with the number of 11. I mean, it's 6 and 5, which is two of the two hidden letters of the name of Yahweh. Anyways, that 23rd letter is called the Ga, with it's an Ngah, Nga, okay? And in the Arabic, it has a significant nasal pronunciation, but in the Hebrew, it's gone. It was assimilated into, of all things, the word friend. Let me explain. The letter could have been called the Ga, and we would have a very different perspective on that letter all the time. But instead, we have it called the ayin. So anybody who's a Hebrew speaker will not hear the word Ga and know what Ga means, okay, which I'll explain in a minute, but instead would immediately think eyeballs, okay? Now, there's a couple significant things here. The first, and this is important, is that the actual ocular nerve set of the two eyeballs creates a Ga. And we could get into the depth of that. But there is some intrigue in this. And the significance of that intrigue has to do with the level of consciousness, which we'll get into here in a minute. But the premise, and this is important, is that Judah indicates that if Benjamin does not return to Jacob, that Jacob, and maybe I shouldn't call him Jacob, maybe I should say his father, because we don't know whether it's Israel or Jacob in this instance. But we do know that he says, if I return to my father without the child, an evil will find him. Well, let's just go with this really quick here. As a Hebrew speaker, if you hear the word ayin, you think eyeball. If you hear the word resh, you think head, right? Those are two Hebrew words that mean those things. So in principle, resh does not have anything to do with the top of something, doesn't have anything to do with the beginning of something, doesn't have a resh will always be the head, the top of the body, so to speak, in the sense of the thinking or consciousness. Okay. That's how a Hebrew is going to understand the word resh, even a secular one. If they hear the word resh, they think brain, they think head, right? So now what we have is we have head and eyes, or head watches, or watcher of the head. Now, there's two things that are really important here. Number one is remember, this word in Psalm 23 is being translated as shepherd. Okay? That word is being translated as shepherd in Psalm 23. But in this particular verse, it's being translated as evil. The vowel pointings change a little bit, but truth is that a Rhea versus a Ra is an modern day positioning of vowel points. In the ancient pictographic Hebrew, it's spelled the same, except for the fact that this 23rd letter is actually a twisted rope in the pictographs. Now, there's two reasons why this is important. Number one is because when the eyes make their transition back to the brain, they twist, right? So that one eye goes to this side and one eye goes to this side, forming what would appear to be the ayin, right? Okay, there's more. In all of this, it is very important that when we are understanding this, that we think in terms of it would be called the ayin. So a Hebrew would hear the word ayin, would never think ga, would never think twisted rope. So the concept is that it's a drawing of a head and the drawing of a twisted rope results in a context of what? Of something wrong with the consciousness. Versus if there's an eye, it's somebody who watches the consciousness or watches over another, a shepherd. Now, if we called it the Resh Ga all the time, then we would instantly connect it with the word evil. But we call it Resh Ayin no matter what. Even in this particular verse, if a Hebrew man is looking at this word, he thinks to himself, oh, that's a resh and an ayin. But in this case, it's translated evil. But in the old pictographs, it would have been very clear. One would be a twisted rope, one would be an eyeball. Now, there's a number of things we can get into, and there's plenty of videos you can go watch on my channel that will talk about the word evil versus the word light, and the concept of a strong mind versus a twisted head. But what I want you to think about is that it will find Jacob. Now, this is important because Judah tells Joseph, let me be a slave in your place. Because what happens? They come back and they say, we're all your slaves. Now, I could get on a bit of a soapbox about how they don't want to go back to their father and face him after all this. And so they're willing to stay in Egypt, right? We're all your slaves. And Joseph says, I'm a just man, right? I'm a just man. And therefore, since I'm a just man, only the man who stole the cup is the one who will stay, right? Which, of course, was Benjamin. And so then he has Benjamin bound and all that stuff. And then Judah says, hey, whoa. First of all, if I don't take him back, really bad stuff's going to happen to my pop, right? And also, why don't you let me be your slave in his place, so he can go back to my father. Otherwise, this twisted consciousness is going to find my father. Now, we already have some contextual evidence based upon the last three Midrashes that Jacob has two identities. He has an identity crisis, right? And truth be told, is identity crisis is at the core of all human dysfunction. Okay. So there's three issues that we run into when it comes to identity crisis. Issue number one is not believing, living, or using as a filter the identity that you were given by God. Second is the identity that we want to make people think that they think about us because we fear, pay attention to this now, we fear, because this is the twisted rope right here. We fear not what people think about us. In other words, even if a person says that they think a certain way about us, what we fear is what we think they think about us. A person can tell another person, you are amazing. And you will think in your head, they don't really think that. And I'm afraid of what they actually think. And therefore, I'm going to downplay this. I'm not really that amazing. Right? That is what we think they think about us. That's what we fear. We don't fear what they think about us. We fear what we think they think about us, right? And so we create these images, or we create these presentations, or these acts, right? These scripted acts to present ourselves to them in such a manner that would affect how we think they think about us. In other words, our minds would go, okay, now that I've controlled the situation and created the mask, and now they have something to actually view, this is what they'll think about me. Right? That is a twisted rope. That is the twisted consciousness. So then we have that. So we have the self that we truly are, the self that we believe we are, and the self that we present to others as a result of being afraid of what people will think we think, or what we think they will think about us. In other words, it doesn't even matter what they tell us. You can say, I love you. And in your mind, you say, you don't love me. You actually don't. I need to create a system of belief by which you love me. And that is the mechanism of the twisted mind. That's the mechanism of the twisted consciousness. So what's this concept of it finding Jacob? We could look at this in three different ways. We could say he had it and lost it, and now it is trying to find him again. He never had it, and now it's going to find him again. It has been pursuing him, and really technically these two are the same, right? So he never had it and it's pursuing him. So we may go narrow it down to two, or he lost it and now it's trying to find him again. Well, here's the intrigue. What is the difference between the twisted consciousness and the not twisted consciousness? What is Judah saying here? What would Joseph understand Hebraically? Not that my father would go crazy. Not that my father would have something bad happen to him. This is a word translated as calamity when it comes to Job, or translated calamity when it comes to Isaiah 45:7. I, the Lord, create evil and create darkness and form light and make shalom. Now, we're not going to translate it as calamity. Job said, shall we accept from the Lord tov ve'ra? Shall we accept from the Lord good and not evil? Right? The context, the concept here is that when we get it in its right perspective, this is not calamity. And some calamity will fall upon Jacob because he doesn't get to see his son again. No, he'll return to the wrong identity. And what is that? That's Jacob versus Israel. Jacob versus Israel, right? Okay. I will remind you that when a name change occurs, a lifestyle change occurs. And when a name change occurs, an enabling occurs that didn't exist there before. And when a name change occurs, the lifestyle change is expected to be permanent, not some hope you get it right, right? The change, that lifestyle change is supposed to be permanent. However, we're going to learn from this parasha, and this is going to be important. Identity is in a state of crisis until purpose exists. And if you are tied up in the wounds, the entitlements, the limiting beliefs of a twisted consciousness, then you will not be walking in your purpose. You will have things come right up in front of you and stop. You will desire a specific item, some material item, and your friend will get it. Your neighbor will get it, but it never ends up actually coming to you because you're operating in a false identity. You're operating in a state of twisted consciousness. So what is Judah really saying to Joseph that Joseph would understand? All that my father has become will regress, and he will return to the man he was before his transition. Wow. What a concept, right? What a concept. Okay. So that's pretty close to the 30-minute time period we have for each question. We'll jump into this next question, spend about 15 minutes working on it, and then take a brief break, and then spend about another 15 minutes working on it, and then we'll move on to the third question. So what is the next question?
So question number 2, what does the word dismayed here mean in 45 verse 3?
Dismayed in 45 verse 3. Okay, so context. First and foremost, after Judah says, my father's identity will regress, Joseph loses it. He cannot play the game anymore. Why? Because if there's anything that is evident in all of Joseph's lifestyle, from the beginning in chapter, I believe it is 37, until now, is that he is very, very, very loyal and attached to his father. Now, this is important. Joseph then has a reaction. And when he has that reaction, he tells all the Egyptians to get out of his home. And only his brothers are present, and he speaks in Hebrew to them, Ani Yosef. And all of a sudden, his brothers are dismayed. So that's what we need to get into and explore here when we ask that question. What is it? What is the significance, or what is the meaning here of dismayed? Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into it. I have to close this and reopen. Okay, so let's jump over to Genesis, and very specifically in 45, and look at our word here, terrified in his presence. Let's look at this word. Okay, so if we just go down and look at this, his brothers did not answer him because they were dismayed. And the Hebrew word is bahal, okay? To disturb, alarm, or terrify, right? To disturb, alarm, or terrify. And bahal, let's look at first usage. first usage is actually this verse, right? And so when we are looking at this, a couple things we want to do is say, okay, what exactly is going on with the brothers at this moment? Well, I think our first and our most relevant one is probably going to move into the realm of what it is in the Amharic right here. I think this is Ethiopian Coptic right here for Amharic. And so it means to hasten, right? It means to hasten or feel disquieted. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to go ahead and chat about this a little bit. So first of all, and I think this is important, when we are working with trying to interpret Hebrew, one of the mistakes that is often made in Christian circles is that they actually have a tendency to, if they're studious enough not to be parrots, it is important in the grand scheme of things that we understand that that's probably the norm, that they will hear what the pastor says, repeat it to another, and think they're doing the service of God. But for those distinct few who learn to study, who learn inductive study, who learn to work through and digest the food of the Torah, the food of the prophets, the food of the Psalms, to digest the heart of God, the wisdom of God, they go and they get a strong concordance. Well, there's two very important things that we need to get into when it comes to this. The first is that a strong concordance is good to an extent. You see me use it all the time. Strong's concordance number, pop it up, boom. Two things you got to know. Number one is that it is concorded to the Anglican King James doctrinal bias translation of the Bible. Oh, but it gets worse. And when I say it gets worse, I want you to think about something. If a Bible was ever going to communicate that you are a supernatural being having a human experience and that you have been given agency to rule over a kingdom that is not of this world, and that agency of rulership is based upon a supernatural experience in the physical realm, and that requires a prosperity and abundance that will result in a distribution, what king is going to benefit from teaching you that you're not a peasant? And I'm just going to go a step further. Augustine influenced Protestant Christianity. He himself could not bring himself to start what Luther started and what Calvin followed with. But Calvin himself had a very distinct propagation of the Augustinian doctrines, in that he had concluded and decided that God actually designs people to fail. And it is the sovereignty of God that lets that happen. Well, guess what? James Strong, the guy who not translated, but concorded the Bible, took every single last word and put it against a number and put it against a lexicon and put it against a list to be able to find that word in the English, take it back to the Hebrew, a very, very powerful tool for the universities and now for the common man. Believed that God designed people to fail, that some people were designed to fall and fail in order for those who were designed to rise up and overcome to be successful. That's the short version of Calvinism. But the bottom line is James Strong believes these things. He's a Presbyterian. And so not only do we have the biased King James version, but now we have him taking the biased King James version and shoving it down the Hebrew culture, Hebrew lifestyle, Hebrew pictographic language's throat and forcing it into a state. Which means what? We need to go back to the pictographs and we need to see what they say there. But in this case, this concept of being dismayed, this bahal, has some pretty interesting implications in the ancient pictographic Hebrew. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're just going to get this Strong's Concordance number here. And we'll jump over to the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, which consequently is going to be this one. And we'll go ahead and put that Strong's Concordance number in and begin to discover what is actually in this word. Where is this word coming from? Why does it have this context? Okay, so of course, we'll just jump right over to it. And in the ancient Hebrew, the actual thing, or in the ancient Hebrew lexicon, the actual thing we're looking for is this PR. That PR tells us that is the first and foremost authoritative parent root, pictograph pair, which is a bait and a lamed. And I will remind you that the bait is a tent and the lamed is a shepherd's crook. So what's important here? Not the action, not the abstract. So not the AC, okay? And not the AB. But instead, the CO, which is what? The concrete, okay? The concrete. Why? Why is that relevant? I'll just address it from right here. The reason it's relevant is because in ancient Hebrew lifestyle and actions, it is important that we understand that if you can't see it, you can't hear it, and you can't feel it, it doesn't exist. This is an ancient Hebrew lifestyle thought process. In what capacity does reality exist? You have to be able to hear it, see it, and touch it. It has nothing to do with taste and smell. In the sense that for a Hebrew, that is the concrete concept. Why is that important? Because number one, first usage becomes very imperative. And in other words, the way that Torah first uses a word is usually how it is intended to be interpreted throughout. Second is that first usage also contains the parent root. And that parent root being used at that time in that way is relevant as well. Because we know Torah is God-breathed. We know that Torah is actually mouth-to-mouth speech, where Moses spoke as God spoke, one and the same. They were in total echadness or unison with each other, meaning that the concrete is the most imperative. Now, in the electronic version of the ancient Hebrew lexicon of the Bible, all the stems for the concrete are given, okay? So those are all of the actual stems right there. But the actual concrete that is present in this is actually going to have something to do with movement and specifically of a stream. Now, I can tell you that the reason I know this is because I have a paperback copy, a hardback copy of the book. But I want to show you something interesting. In the abstract, nothing is one of the words that's used, okay? Furthermore, I want you to notice something very imperative to this set, and that is that there is no pictographic definition right here. That is very important. Let me show you an example. Let's just go back one single parent root and take a look at this. In a normal pictographic definition set, it will say the bait is a picture of the house and represents what's inside. The yod is a hand, and combined these mean hand inside, right? Or however we want to put it. An emptying of the hand or desiring to be filled, right, is the word be. All right. But in this particular set, letter set, we have stream, flow, and then trouble. Okay. Meaning what? This is a little bit more, it's a little bit more tumultuous in this way. But let's see if we can kind of identify something a little bit more. Come to nothing when effort is given. That's the first definition of Beit Lamed. So what happens when we put Beit Lamed out there just as our context of the verse? Okay, so going back to our verse, we would say it this way. Joseph said to his brothers, Ani Yosef, is my father still living? But they could not answer him because they were giving an effort without any product being produced. It changes, doesn't it? I'm not going to stop here. It changes. But let's say we keep going a little bit and try to find contextually what that means once we add the hay. Well, interestingly enough, when we add the yod to the set, so beli, it means unaware, without design, attention, preparation, or premeditation. Unaware. Okay. Look at this one. Taval is confusion, right? So how does confusion have anything to do with come to nothing when effort is given? How does confusion have something to do with a stream? How does confusion have something to do with a stream flowing, right? Okay, now let's look here. Then we've got tavalit, to ruin, a complete flowing away of something by destruction. To ruin, right? And then we have belo, which is a tribute, a flowing or a mixing of a liquid or a solid is balal. Then we've got balal as to mix. So were they mixed? Was that what was going on there? And then we have aval, which is a flowing of tears. And then we have aval being nevertheless, or in spite of that, a flowing of certainty. Okay. And then we have bala'ah. Bala'ah, a flowing away of life. Bala'ah, which is like to get old. And then we've got haval, to be vain, as in to make an effort, and making an effort to look valuable but not have any value. And then, of course, haval being what? The state of emptying a contents of usefulness, right? Okay. Then we get to our word. To disturb the quiet or agitate is bahal. Bahala is dismay, right? And then we've got haste, which is basically to goad somebody, right? And then we've got bal'ah in the sense, balah in the sense of flowing away of function, life, or strength. So now you could see how this word actually seems to give us a little bit deeper insight into the concept of what's happening here. So dismay kind of takes on this different characteristic. When we come back, we're going to take a brief break here, but when we come back, we will discuss what's actually happening to them spiritually. And we'll explain that in a minute. Okay. Take a brief break here. Shabbat Shalom, welcome back. So we were discussing what does the word dismayed mean, right? So one of the things that I want to say, and I'm talking a little bit out of my lane. What I mean by that is that I'm not an Egyptologist, and but I will say that from a linguistic perspective, the compare contrast between the Hebrew language and the Egyptian language, which of course was a very difficult thing to discover and decipher. Um, the Egyptian language is very, um, it's not, um, it's not like the Hebrew where you have a concrete concept becoming an abstract concept. Instead, you have a logical system of 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 literal words operating, and then really odd descriptions of things that are not understood. And so, first of all, and this is important, up until this point, an interpreter has been present to give communication possibility between Joseph and his brothers. But all of a sudden, out of the middle of nowhere, Joseph speaks in Hebrew and says, Ani Yosef. Now, there are two very important things you need to know. First of all, the odds of a person finding after they have sold their slave is impossible. And what I mean by that is there was no records kept beyond the descriptive elements. They might say something like Hebrew man, right? Or tall, dark-skinned human, or man, or female. And that would be it for any documentation. Consequently, it's also important to know that by this time there were records kept on papyri. However, what is important to know is that a lot of transactions were not recorded unless they were official and royal. So the odds of finding a slave after you've sold them are zero. It just didn't exist, right? So what did the brothers assume then was going to occur with Joseph? They'd never see him again. They'd never have to deal with him again. But what was the big deal? Why were they so reactive to him? And what does this word dismayed or bahal actually indicate? Well, remember that word is the bait and the lamed. If you were to double the first letter, baval, that is actually the Hebrew word for Babylon, Baval or Bavel. Okay. So what I want you to think about is, why did they call Babylon Babylon? Well, first and foremost, because God actually made it impossible for them to use their tongues to speak to each other and communicate, which interfered with the echadness that they were in. That was the corporate collective consciousness, where the intensification of all power in the universe stuffed into something that could observe the city said, this is what they begin to do. Now nothing will be impossible for them. Consequently, the word, this is what they begin to do, is actually the word used in Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, where God determines that there needs to be a flood. In other words, Babel was following suit. And that's important on a number of reasons. But one of the most important ones, and this is relevant, is that word Bahal is related to that word Bavel. Meaning what? This confusion was a confounding of language. So, in an interesting way, what do we know of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What are what are some important things? Number one, we know that they were pastoral and not urban. We know that they did not believe in urban lifestyle. We know that they were removed from the dominant culture of their time. They were not participants in the political systems of their time. They were not participants in the social systems of their time. They were not participants in the economic systems of their time. Their trade, their actions, their choices, and their language was different. And they, amongst other people around them, believed that they were all priests, that they were all spiritual, that they were all connected to God, whereas the priests of the Canaanite peoples actually believed they were the only ones who were connected to anything spiritual, and the rest of the people were not. The difference between a Hebrew priest versus a Canaanite priest was that a Hebrew priest believed that all the people were spiritual. So the reason why this is important is because what we have here is Joseph going from this, for lack of better words, uncircumcised Egyptian in the eyes of his brothers to a Hebrew. And all of a sudden, they don't know what to do. They have communication where they didn't know communication existed. And worst yet, here's the slave they sold. And what do they already know? He is the dominant culture of their time. Joseph literally was the only person who had food, and he had the key, and he had the lock. And truth be told, is that every culture, every people, every economic system, every political system, every social system actually revolved around Joseph. Because it didn't matter what you believed about gods. It didn't matter what you believed about your rights. It didn't matter what you believed about your peoples. Joseph was the only thing that you had to worry about. And now, here's the slave they sold. So were they dismayed in the sense that they were like, oh no, he's gonna deal with us in a bad way? Yes, but we need to connect the spiritual here, because the Hebrew peoples were spiritual, the Canaanites were not. The Hebrew peoples were spiritual, the Egyptians were not. Don't get me wrong. The Egyptians had a whole bunch of mystic stuff going on, and they had the Chasdim among them. But you need to remember that Abraham was a Chasdim who had become enlightened to the divine of Yahweh. And therefore, his son was a Chasdim who was enlightened to the divinity of Yahweh, right? Etc., on down the line. So Hebrews believed they were different. And this whole time, in their minds, they're going, you know what? We're spiritually to this jerk, and we have to bow to him, right? And so that is where that Bahal becomes so important, is because of what's going on there. But remember, there's no pictographic thing. Here's the little nugget in this word. Beit Lamed is actually house of authority. And the hay being in between them is an observer, or someone who beholds the house of authority. Behold the house of authority. Built into this whole thing is a pictographic concept of the beholder interfering with the house and the authority. It's in between the two of them. And what's interesting is how that works is the center letter augments the two outside letters in a Hebrew word. How do we know that? Because when we start to get into the grammar and we start to get in what are called weak verbs, the yod involved drop out first, and the pairs are brought back together. And then suffixes, infixes, and prefixes are added to conjugate a Hebrew verb. So in this case, we have a hey. The hey drops, beit lamed becomes the actual Hebrew root pair. And of course, this is also a child root in that the yod, the hey, or the vav is present in the word, and we just drop it. But what you got to understand is that removes the beholder or the observer from the house of authority, which means what? The observer is somehow interfering, and it's creating, according to the the nomadic definitions, chaos. A lot we could discuss there, but I want to kind of open it up and give an opportunity for people who are on Slack, the core ministry participants, the congregation, to potentially speak up and comment on what they've learned so far or what their opinions are.
I think that's pretty cool as far as like the observer, it drops out and because it's kind of getting in the way, right, of the house of authority. And you could really see the fact that if it needs to drop out so that there is a house of authority, because we've talked on many occasions and even today about how we observe things, whether we see a friend or a foe, whether we see good or evil, what are we seeing in that observation that is limiting us from being that house of authority? So I thought that was pretty awesome, how that observer being obviously us, right? And we had talked about how Jacob's observation would have limited his identity or even reversed his identity from being Israel. And it's that observation that makes us the observer, right? And how the observer needs to step out of the way in order to be the house of authority.
Interesting. Okay, so then let's go ahead and let's do the next question.
Okay, next question. Let's get back here. Question number 3. What is the significance of verse 45, verse 20?
Significance of verse 45, verse 20.
Yeah.
All right. So verse 45, or chapter 45, verse 20, actually is going to be do not be concerned about your belongings, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. So let's talk a minute about what's happened here. So Joseph has identified himself, but in that process, however, and I've intentionally left this cry out that occurs with Joseph, where the house of Pharaoh hears it and the Egyptians themselves hear it, but only his brothers are present in the room when it happens. Pharaoh somehow finds out that his brothers are in Egypt. But then he takes it a step further, and Pharaoh finds out that Joseph's father is alive. And the identity of Joseph starts to become apparent. Okay. Now, it's important that we talk a little bit about these wagons. But basically, what happens is Joseph tells his brothers, go get my father. Pharaoh says, yes, and take these wagons. And here's the deal. This is just for people. Don't bring anything. Don't bring anything. Only bring yourselves, because you will have the best of all the land of Egypt, right? Okay. And so Um, in verse 17, it says, Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, do this, load your animals, and go on back to the land of Canaan. Get your father and your families and come back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can eat from the richness of the land. You were also commanded to tell them this. Do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your dependents and your wives, and bring your father here. Do not be concerned about your belongings, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Okay. So, what's the significance of this verse? Well, it's this, and we'll get deeper into this throughout the day. Number one, the rabbinical texts, and specifically the mystical rabbinical texts, say that when Abraham redeemed Sarah from Pharaoh, in other words, the plagues came upon Egypt, Pharaoh returned Sarah to Abraham and gave him riches, that Sarah went into the land of the serpent, but did not succumb to the serpent like Eve, and therefore redeemed the feminine principle or the feminine aspect of God. Now, if that be true, then we need to accept that when anything goes down to Egypt, it is regressing into the actual Hebrew word for Egypt, and that is bindings or limitations. And when we start to get into the idea of a descension, because there's actually no real Hebrew word for down, there's a Hebrew word for descending, and there's a Hebrew word for moving in a downward direction. And that is the word yarad, where we get the word Jordan, right? Which the Yarden is actually the descending waters, okay? So the premise of ascending and descending starts to be mentioned or starts to appear in the system of mystical thought with Jacob and his ladder. But here we have this idea of dissension as there being some sort of not necessarily regression per se, but as a movement downward into Egypt, a movement downward into bindings. And it's interesting because of what we're about to get into when we get into these next few questions. But one of the things that I really, really want to touch upon is this concept that Pharaoh says, when you come down here, leave your stuff in Canaan. Now, there's a number of things that I could really get into here about when you actually have a name change and a lifestyle change and an enabling. There's also a point where when you get a name change, you exceed your potential and movement occurs. And what I mean by that is that when you begin to walk in your potential, there's a point in time where you can you can possibly exceed your potential. For example, one of the deep mystical concepts that I learned early in my walk was that Adam actually exceeded the potential his potential in the garden. That there was no way he was going to be able to stay in the garden. There was a point where he exceeded his potential. And when you get a name change and you get an enabling and you get and you start to walk in your potential, you will begin to move away from that which you exceed. The concept of a prophet not being received in his town is based upon that concept. The concept of a person not being able to stay in their limiting beliefs, their entitlements and their wounds, when they start to move away from dysfunction and start to move into function, and when they start to move into potential and step into purpose, they will most likely be moved to the next thing, the next level, as it were. So it's interesting because basically what I want you to think about is, what was Pharaoh telling Jacob to do here? He was telling him, leave everything behind. Only bring the people. Leave your livestock, your wealth, your material items behind. Now, what's interesting here is that there's a couple elements of rectification that occur. That is, number one, part of what is going on here is Jacob is being told to come to Mitzrayim, to move into the limitations. Okay? However, and this is important, something has to occur. In fact, we're going to get into this concept of purpose when we talk about Judah later on. But the premise is that every single element of this process has to happen the way it's happening, has to occur the way that it's occurring, because of what is actually represented within Joseph, within Jacob, within Pharaoh, within all this. So we need to remember, land of the serpent, okay? Land of the serpent, land of the Nakash. Then we need to take it a step further and say that Jacob is given an invitation to go down into this, told to leave his abundance behind, because a greater abundance is in Mitzrayim. And I will tell you, it seems as though when God wants to bless somebody with abundance, he brings them through Egypt. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so that's why that verse is important.
Well, I love the fact that you bring up quite often the fact that we need to remember that this was not written for them. It is written for us. And what can we glean from Israel needing to go into Egypt in order for that abundance? We've talked about quite often the fact that we're spiritual beings living a human experience, right? And that we were not born into sin and dismay and discouragement, right? We get there through life experiences often, right? So we're born in our young lives, teach us to withhold, to be bound, right? Egypt, 2 bindings, right? And then we have to learn in order to get out of that binding, in order to have that abundance. So we can see that this is actually a purpose written for us to see the process of, they were born free. We are too, right? But for whatever reason, we all go into some type of binding, fear and doubt. And we have to learn to get out of that in order to have the abundance.
Yeah, and there's actually a powerful discussion coming up, and that is going to be in question 7, which we will bring up after the lunch break, one of the things that I want to kind of touch on here, and you guys who are actually out in the internet, but who are on the Zoom call, you are welcome to unmute and comment on these things, because I want to make sure that that we get the full picture, and that there is definitely a lot to take in this concept of Jacob going down to Egypt. Okay. When it comes to bindings, because number one, and I think this is important, Jacob has two identities. Okay. One identity is of Yahweh's design, that truly who he was created to be. That's Israel. But who was Israel truly created to be? This is deep. According to Jeremiah chapter 31, 31 through 34, the bride of God, the bride of the Creator, is Israel. So I want to remind you of a concept called the responsibility of the bride. And it is a Hebrew permutation of the word Yachal, Yod, Kaf, Lamed. In the Hebrew word Yachal is a concept of the Kaf, Lamed. Now, Kaf, Lamed works in this way. Kaf being a hand that wraps around something a certain way. The Hebrews believed that this concept that you could shape your hand in a certain way was the concept of conforming, in the sense of what? Pottery, right? Pottery would conform to the shape of the hand. And so an open palm was that power to shape the pottery, right? Okay, so the principle is that the open palm, or the kaf, the Hebrew pictographic letter kaf, which I'll show you in a second, and the lamed, the shepherd's crook, meant what? Conform to the staff, or staff in hand. So in principle, what that meant was that a able-bodied human took upon themselves the responsibility of being the shepherd. By taking the staff in hand, they were accepting the authority granted through the jurisdictional granting. In other words, I give you power over this particular little piece. You see, the movie Bruce Almighty or Evan Almighty being centrally located to like a little patch of New York, or a little patch of a different part of New York, a little chunk of land, a little city or town, right? And there was kind of a discussion about how, I think it's in Bruce Almighty, when he says, well, you didn't think I was going to give you all of that, right? I gave you a little jurisdiction. Well, that comes from the concept of agency. And so in principle, we are given agency. So that concept of taking the staff and receiving the staff, and then moving people, moving objects, moving sheep, becomes about the recognition that the staff is the jurisdictional element, the object of agency. And in covenant, there will always be a concept of an object of agency. For example, in a Hebrew marriage, there's a ketubah. That is an object of agency, a jurisdictional granting of authority, as it were. You want to get really deep is when you realize that who's granting the jurisdictional authority is actually the woman. We get into that in another time. All right. So now the concept, and this is important, is in the sense of there being a kaf lamed. And then what happens is there's a yod on the end of it. Now, what's interesting about this is the word yakal actually is the Hebrew word for able, and can be translated also as willful, and in a bad sense. Well, what's interesting is when that permutation occurs, there's a yod, kaf, lamed. When that yod moves to the middle of a of the letter set in a permutation, it is the word keel. And the word keel actually means one who is bound. Okay? So she goes from having the yod on the right side, where her hand, or the indication of her hand is that it is in on the right side, or in the place of honor of the one who embraced authority, moves in between. And now what's interesting is the two letters get split apart, and the yod is in between, and it means prisoner. It means one who is bound. Now, that's not where the transition stops, because once we move the yod to the other side of the kaf lamed, and this is where I really wish I still had my, I can't wait to get to our new facility, because I'll have my whiteboard back. But where the transition goes from the yod on the right-hand side to the yod in the center to the yod on the left-hand side, goes from being willful or having power to being bound to being a vessel. Now, what's interesting is if we propose that the middle one, the bound one, is actually trapped between the kaf and the lamed, but remember that that word keel is a weak verb, and the yod drops out and comes back to that concept of being of grasping or staff in hand. Then we have this concept, or this idea of there being a vessel versus a not vessel, and a not vessel. And what's interesting is the transition from this side to this side. So not vessel on this side transitions to vessel through the binding. We know that Israel had to go into Mitzrayim. We know that he had to go in because he is the bride of the Creator. He had to go into a state of binding before he could become the vessel. Now, what's interesting is as the vessel starts to become filled, the yod drops out, and a second lamed is added, and a hey is added to feminize it, and that becomes the word bride, kalala, or kala, depending on how you read the laments. And a kala is somebody who has been purchased through dowry. Now, when you start to put this all together, because what happens? 70 souls go down to Egypt, 610,000 come out. And that's just the men on foot. That's not counting the women and children. Upwards of about 1.2 million people leave the binding. And that particular group becomes the beginning of the bride of the Creator. Just as Abraham brought his bride down into Mitzrayim and redeemed Eve's transgression with the serpent. Remember, it says in Paul's letter that Eve was deceived and transgressed, but Adam sinned. Eve was beguiled by the serpent. According to the mystical writings, when Abraham brings Sarah down, redeems her from the land of the serpent, he was actually beginning or creating the pattern by which the bride of the Creator would be redeemed, right? So we understand that Israel, as a name, has to go down to Mitzrayim. Oh, but it gets better. Anyways, at this point in time, I definitely want to take a break. We'll come back after lunch, but I just want to see if there's anything that the congregation would like to comment on real quick to bring up concerning what I just said, what I just taught.
We definitely can see that happening. I mean, I brought up the fact that, we're born free, and then our youth and childhood typically will take us into those bindings, right? And that whole process that we discussed through that change of the yod in between those letters. So we can definitely see that process of the bride needing to come out of the bindings.
Yep. So I would like to basically leave you guys with something really quick here. And that is, I want to read you the story really quick about Abraham in Egypt. And I'm not going to share it. I'm going to go ahead and just read it to you. So there was a famine in the land. So Avram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because of the famine in the land was severe. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, or Sarai, "Look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' They will kill me, but let you live. Please say you're my sister, so it will go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account." Then Avram entered Mitzrayim, and the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh. So the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Avram well because of her, and Avram acquired flocks and herds and male and female donkeys, male and female slaves and camels. But Yahweh struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abraham's wife, Sarai. So Pharaoh sent for Avram, I'm sorry, not Abraham, Avram, and said, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her as my wife? Now here is your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him that they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Now, we've commented in the past that when a person goes down to Egypt, they leave in prosperity. We've commented in the past that when a person goes down to Egypt, they do not begin in prosperity. So there's a couple things that I want to leave you with. The first is that Avram, representing the creator of the universe, takes his bride down into Egypt. There, plagues occur to cause her to become delivered back to him, and they leave the land of Egypt. Is it possible that the very life you're living right now is prophetic or is being lived out as a system that will eventually affect an entire nation? All right, let's go to lunch. We will end this broadcast and come back after lunch and continue with our questions. For those of you who cannot stay, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.